Joining me now is Jack Jenkins. Jack is the senior religion reporter for Think Progress. He was previously senior writer and researcher for the Faith and Progressive Policy Initiative at the Center for American Progress. He's been a reporter, a blogger for religion news services, among others, a lot of other outlets as well. He has a bachelor's in history of religion and philosophy and a master's of divinity from Harvard University. So he knows his religion stuff. And his bio says he also plays harmonica and ukulele. Hey, first of all, Jack, welcome to the program. Secondly, although I mainly play other instruments, I play ukulele too.
Ah, no way. Good to find another one.
Yeah, in fact, what happened was, before we get into what we're here to talk about, my wife and I went to Hawaii, and I bought a beautiful koa wood ukulele while I was there. And when I got back after about 3 weeks, she said, "You know, the ukulele is nice, but don't bring it to bed anymore." Don't. So I get your addiction to the ukulele.
Yeah. Let's stick around with you.
Yeah, and thanks for coming on the program. And you've been writing some great stuff lately. What caught my eye was something you did last week in Think Progress. The URL says, "When Mormons were white." The title, the headline given it is "What a 19th Century Campaign to Declare Mormons Non-White Tells Us About Modern Islamophobia." Very interesting. So tell us, first of all, what was this 19th century campaign?
So Mormons, after they kind of developed in the 1820s, and then they went through some growth in the 1830s and 40s, underneath Joseph Smith, the founder. But that growth was accompanied by growing pains, and effectively, wherever Mormons went, they encountered resistance. And there's a lot of reasons for why that was, but as they continued to grow, the communities that would resist them got more and more fervent in their resistance, and they kept trying to characterize them as different, as other, as not like them. And by the time the Mormons were expelled from several states and ended up in Utah, when you get to the 1860s, you have a military doctor who gave a report back to the Senate saying that he believed that Mormons weren't actually of the same race as other white Americans anymore, that they had become something different. And this maintained throughout the rest of the 19th century and into the early 20th century this distinction of Mormons not quite being white, of being something different and something specifically to be feared and to be subjugated.
It's I don't know how to put this, but they seem really white to me.
Yeah.
They seem, I guess what I'm struggling with here is first of all, how did this doctor, how could people plausibly, I mean, leaving aside the issue of it shouldn't even matter if you're white, right, not white, right, and all of those issues, and the conflation in modern times, which we'll get to, of ethnicity and race and belief, which of course the Jewish people suffered for horrifically in the 20th century. But even before we get to all of that, how can someone even plausibly make the argument that people who have converted from one religion to another have thereby changed somehow their genetic composition or their physical construct or anything? How could anybody even convince themselves of that?
Right. I mean, there's no good logic here. I mean, if you were to ask a 19th century person who was declaring Mormons non-white, what they would tell you is that since there was a subset of Mormons that did practice polygamy, that practice somehow made them a different people, that the act of having multiple wives inevitably created a different breed of human beings. But even that wasn't consistent. Sometimes they would say that it was because of polygamy. Sometimes they would say it's because they've been living out in Utah for too long. Sometimes they would say it's because they're melding Eastern values and Western values, and it creates something new. The truth was, race, as even the modern construction of race that we have today, it's always in flux. But it was even different back then. And so sometimes race was conflated with, as you mentioned, belief and geography, as opposed to, say, the color of your skin or melanin. Because the same thing was done to Irish immigrants who were Catholic, and as you mentioned, Jewish people as well. Even though they would literally, you could come over as a Jew and then convert to Christianity, and you would change races that way. And so this was in some ways common at the time, but there's no like good reason why
Yeah,
how they
I
did
mean,
that.
it's also horrific in terms of what it says about their moral or spiritual state. But at the same time, it also contradicts the 19th century, as I recall, not personally, but from study of history. It was also filled with people who had horrific racial theories based on that other races had lower brows or smaller brain capacity, physical differences, and yet at the same time, they're basically acknowledging on some level, whether deliberately or not, that race is a social construct that's merely that they can use at will to ostracize and then brutalize minorities of people who trouble them. Right?
Right. Yeah, I mean that was actually the fascinating obvious inconsistency, 2020 hindsight in the 21st century, that you're right. That if you would think that these people who would construct these physiological differences would look at someone who is literally just a convert to Mormonism, would have Scotch Irish or English ancestry, but yet that doctor who went to Utah and made this construction, when he came back and gave a report to the U.S. Senate saying that Mormons were a different race, based it on his concept of science. And he produced a paper on it. And then several other academics wrote papers based on that. And they were trying to construct a physiological difference that would explain why this group of people are lesser, like physiologically, even though they look just the same, are lesser than the people who were, say, in Massachusetts or New England and were Protestant. So I mean, you're right. It doesn't make any sense.
No, it doesn't. And we're talking with Jack Jenkins of Think Progress about the campaign in the 19th century to declare Mormons non-white. Now, this was at a period in American history, and we can talk about how much we've changed or not since then, but this was at a period in American history when among white Americans, I believe it was pretty much acceptable to consider non-white people worthy of slavery, of subjugation, even of eradication in the move westward, where we were going through the great westward expansion, the inevitability of frontier in their belief system and all that. So was that part of it, that by declaring them non-white, we were basically declaring we as a nation, we're basically a majority nation, we're basically declaring them worthy of subjugation and or eradication?
Yes, actually, quite literally. In Missouri, when they were expelled from Missouri in particular, there's a thing called the extermination order that the governor of Missouri issued, and basically said, these people are our enemies, and we need to exterminate all of them and drive them from our lands. Now, that was still when the argument of them being non-white was still being constructed. So they were just saying that they were different, they were not like us, all these different euphemisms. But it tends to be, especially in that time period, it's still kind of true now, but definitely in that time period, anybody who was in power and had something in their way, they would invent some sort of distinction or title or claim to say that they aren't deserving of that space. Now, when they expelled those people from Missouri, that was so that the rest of Missouri could claim their land. It was literally a land grab to grab the Mormon land. And then when after the Mormons were in Utah, which used to be Mexico, and after the Mexican-American War became part of the United States, the federal government didn't like that they were out there on federal land, and they wanted to take it back. That would be the argument of some historians. And so it's exactly to your point. It's the same system of saying, we want this land, we don't want your votes, we don't want this sort of change, whatever thing that they're messing up about regular society, so we're going to make up an excuse to completely exterminate you.
Now, what does this, to get to the second half of your headline, Jack, what does this tell us about modern Islamophobia?
Well, I think what's really interesting when you read through this campaign to declare Mormons non-white is it's in some ways almost the exact same language, and right down to like the same phrases that is being used today to say that Muslims cannot possibly live in the United States. So you'll see this conflation of religious belief. Someone is Muslim, and so there's all these there are all these polls that say that Muslims are Islam is not compatible, quote unquote, with American values, and that's the same thing that was said with Mormonism, that they were incompatible with the American way. Race, which in the modern context, Muslims can be of multiple races, but they're the ones who are stereotyped and profiled in airports are usually of like a darker complexion, and that there's a lot of lawsuits about that. And in the Mormon case, they just invented the race completely, irrespective of color, and then also of anti-immigrants. So we see the calls to ban Syrian refugees and Muslims in toto from the United States of America. And they also tried to ban Mormons from immigrating into the United States. That was the thing the federal government tried to do. And all of this, I think, the direct parallels between this campaign that the Mormons endured and modern Muslims is actually evident. When there were all these states who were saying that they wanted to ban Syrian refugees from entering their state lines. There was a couple Democrats, but it was almost exclusively Republicans, and all these Republican states decided to ban Syrian refugees, but there was one exception, and that was Utah. Utah refused to do that, and they cited, and the LDS Church cited this history of having been oppressed as a religious group as evidence of that. And then when the next day, when Trump offered his ban on Muslim immigration, the governor of Utah issued a statement referring to the extermination order and the attempt to ban Mormons from immigrating into the United States, and said, as long as I'm governor of this state, we will always take religious refugees. Our state only exists because we were willing to do that. So there's these parallels.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And the dehumanization of Muslims certainly seems to be a big part of this. And part of it seems to me to be the conflation, as you mentioned, Jack Jenkins, of Islam and Arabs, because the idea then we can say, well, Arab is a racial identity, and we don't like that. It astounds most Islamophobes and confounds them if you tell them that of the world's 1.2 billion Muslims, only about 20% of them are actually ethnically Arab. Not that that should matter, and it doesn't matter, but that they're swarthy, that they're dark skinned. It was interesting to me, and I'm sure you followed it closely because you cover religion for Think Progress. But it was interesting to me that that tragic, heartbreaking picture of the small child who drowned, the Syrian refugee who drowned, and how for a moment the hearts of everyone, it seemed, across the political spectrum, open to the plight of these Syrian refugees. But then Donald Trump and Ted Cruz and a couple other guys came along and said, now we got to keep them out unless they're Christian. And it seemed like a lot of Republicans went, oh yeah, that's right. We don't really care. So was that kind of a moment, it seemed to me, where there was a human moment peeking in because they saw, I'm trying to figure out how to put it, the sameness, the humanness of this tragedy, but then they were somehow able to wrap it around in this otherness, this technique of making someone the other, so that if you don't want to deal with them, if you want to expel them, if you want to reject them or exploit them. Is that what do you think about that?
No, I think, if anything, it proves how difficult it is to get rid of racial, religious, and anti-immigrant bigotry. I mean, it is something where you can even stare at a dead child and even have conversations about how it's horrible, and then all of these wrappings of bigotry show back up, and the powerful try to close ranks and protect what they have, and that's, well, go ahead.
No, yeah. I interesting, and I want to get to the end of your thought. We're talking with Jack Jenkins from Think Progress. You were saying, with the Mormons in the 19th century, they wanted the land, they wanted the, and so on. What is it that people want out of Muslims today? I mean, I have some thoughts. I'm interested in yours. What is it that is consciously or unconsciously wanted out of Muslims that people are so willing to dehumanize them this way?
Well, if you're talking about the politicians, they just want the votes. I mean, they know they know that the bigotry sells. And what's interesting is it historically hasn't. For the past few years, a lot of people have tried to use Islamophobia as a way to get elected, and it's only been so successful. It actually hasn't been that successful in the past, but now it really is. And so for them, this is a straight power grab. I feel confident that every single campaign on the GOP side looked at the numbers and said, regardless of whether or not the candidate actually believes it, no matter what, they were looking at numbers and say, if you talk about Muslims in a discriminatory way, that's actually going to win you some of these primary voters. And so I feel certain that's the key reason. The other, in terms of like the on the ground level, like the average American, why they push back on Islamophobia. I mean, that's in some ways similar to the context of what happened in Missouri with the Mormons, in that they were different and they represented change, and that was frightening. And Islam, it represents a lot of things right now, and people don't know what to do. Even if someone has lived in the United States 4 or 5 generations and is Muslim, for Americans, this represents this like larger existential change to our country that will cut them out.
I don't know about you, and this is a quick aside, but I don't know about you, but I don't know if you watched the X-Files, but I was really disappointed in the X-Files the other night on this very topic.
The new episodes, the new ones. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, have you seen it?
I haven't seen this episode.
Well,
what happened?
Hopefully, it was all based on that Muslims are terrorists and scary and all that. So, but you'll see it. You'll decide for yourself. Now, if we can, before you go, Jack Jenkins, just pivot for a second. You've been writing a lot in the last day about Pope Francis and his latest trip. And he is saying that one of his latest things, he said that Donald Trump, speaking of Islamophobia, his plan to build a wall between the United States and Mexico is not Christian. So now Donald Trump, by the way, is such a BSer that when he was asked his favorite part of the Bible, and clearly has never read the Bible in his life, said all of it. Hilarious. But what did the Pope say exactly?
So the Pope was asked. So Trump, knew that Pope Francis is a powerful figure. He knows that, and he's Francis gets the royal treatment, speaks before Congress, everything else. But when when Pope Francis was going to Mexico and clearly standing up for immigrants, and he had a mass yesterday on the border between the United States and Mexico, where he blessed undocumented immigrants across the border, that type of stuff. And so Donald Trump said that he's a very political man, like referring to the Pope, and that he suspected that the Mexican government had co-opted Pope Francis into supporting immigrants, as if Pope Francis had been supporting immigrants his entire life, but also throughout his papacy. And so they asked Pope Francis about this on the plane ride from Mexico back to Rome. And Francis's response was basically, I don't really know, I don't want to weigh in on any specific vote, but any man who says that that immigrants should be walled off, is not a Christian. So he basically literally said Donald Trump is not a Christian. And then he said that the act of building walls as opposed to bridges is an unchristian act.
And this, of course, is completely consistent with church teaching all along about immigrants and about bringing in the stranger. So, unfortunately, we're going to have to cut it off there. But I will conclude by saying now I'm convinced Donald Trump has never read his Bible, because as I recall, the story of Jesus and his family, undocumented, I think, is the fact that they didn't have the right documents was certainly part of their story, wasn't it? You're the expert, but all right. Unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. But Jack Jenkins, religion writer for Think Progress, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.